All right, this is the lecture for the fourth page of the notes under World War I. This is entitled A Flawed Peace. Here's where we left off, Europe in ruins, and this is all about the process and the discussion with what was going to happen with the world, particularly Germany and the losing countries after the war was over. All right. All right, so the nations of the world met at Versailles, which is in France. Versailles, if you remember that from Louis XIV. And 32 nations were there to hash out the disagreements and figure out what they were going to do going forward. So let's look at some of the details of those things. Even though there were 32 countries, there were really 4 countries that led in the discussion after the war was over. And here they are here. These are called the Big Four. 2 means the question, not the Big Four 2, but the Big Four, and the countries they were from. So write down the leader and what country they were from. We have Woodrow Wilson from the United States, Georges Clemenceau from France. We have Vittorio Orlando from Italy. And we have David Lloyd George from Britain. So those are the Big Four. And I'd say of the 4, Italy was the 4th for sure. They all brought their own agendas to this meeting, what they hoped to see accomplished, which really made negotiating kind of difficult, which you're going to find out when we do our simulation. So Woodrow Wilson had this list here. He was a former college professor, and so he was a very intellectual individual, and so he had these ideas about peace that should be implemented going forward. Collectively, they were called the 14 points, as you can see, very cleverly named. All right, none of these actually were put into effect, but if you look over this list real quick, it makes a whole lot of sense. If they had implemented these principles, these directly result or directly relate to things that caused World War I. But none of these, with the exception of the last one, were actually even used. There it is right there. So point number, let me skip number 3 for a second. No, not skip number 3. All right, they used point 14, which was a League of Nations, which was an international organization for resolving issues without war. That's what you can define that at the top for the definitions. And this is the only one that they used. So 14 for number 4, and League of Nations, you can write in the definition at the top. All right, this Treaty of Versailles was signed on the 5-year anniversary of Archduke Ferdinand's assassination. Another interesting date correlation there for you. All right, the stipulations that had to do with Germany. There were separate treaties negotiated for all of the losers of World War I, like Austria-Hungary and Bulgaria and the Ottoman Empire. But the one that had the most significance was Versailles. So let's look at that. All right. Interesting. We'll come back to that. Let's go back. All right, if you look here, I guess we'll come back to the stipulations in the Treaty of Versailles in a moment. Austria was dealt with as well. This is part of the Treaty of Versailles to break it up. You can see some new countries here. All of this used to be Austria-Hungary. But after World War I, there were new nations that were created out of this area. First, Austria was a separate country. Hungary was a separate country. Then you had new countries of Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and you can see it over here, Romania. These are all new countries carved out of territory that previously belonged to Austria. The Ottoman Empire was reduced down to one nation, and that was the nation of Turkey. And then eventually they threw off the Ottomans and ruled themselves. Didn't last very long. Right, the Middle East was divided up amongst European powers. Great Britain, they weren't called colonies anymore because that caused World War I. They were called mandates, which is essentially that these European countries would oversee the transition of these colonies from colony to independence, which was really just another way of saying they would be a colony. So Great Britain received Palestine and Iraq, and France was given Syria and Lebanon. All right, you can see here that there were 4 countries created out of the territory that Russia had given to Germany as part of their treaty. You've got East Prussia here. You have Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia were the 4 new countries created out of Russian territory. Definitely some changes here. All right, this is an interesting political cartoon about the Treaty of Versailles, hinting that the Allies sort of just pushed Germany off the ledge here. So some of these. All right, the main problem about the treaty is it didn't address anything that caused the war. It was just the winner's vendetta against the countries that lost. So that obviously led to World War II. The part about this that really upset the Germans was the war guilt clause. And we can also write this in for number 6, letter A. You can write the war guilt clause. Germany had to take full responsibility. The war was our fault. And we did that. Whose fault was World War I? DBQ. And you could make a really convincing argument that Austria and Serbia were more responsible, but Germany is the one who's going to bear the burden of the guilt afterwards. Another thing that was a problem is these territories that had contributed to the war effort, hoping to be free afterwards, weren't free. They continued to be colonies. And so that caused a lot of unrest and frustration that eventually is going to boil over after World War II. All right, and then lastly, Italy and Japan left this agreement very upset because they didn't get what they expected. They were a powerful nation. They were amongst the leaders, and the big 3, Britain, France, and the U.S., did most of the decision making. They didn't really include Italy and Japan. They certainly didn't give Italy and Japan the territories they were hoping to get. So those 2 countries walked away insulted and frustrated. And that's kind of ironic because we know what side they ended up falling on in World War II. So I'm going to go back and orally give you the question answers here for number 6. We already wrote down 1, that one of the stipulations of the Treaty of Versailles was that they had to sign the war guilt clause. They also had to pay reparation payments. They had to pay back to the Allied countries what it cost them to fight this war, or a fraction of what it cost them to fight this war. So reparation payments. In addition to that, they had to significantly reduce the size of their military. So they weren't allowed to have submarines anymore. They had to have fewer planes and soldiers. They significantly had to reduce the size of their military. And then the 4th stipulation that involved Germany is that they lost territory. They lost territory from every angle of their nation except for the part that touched the ocean or touched the sea. So they lost territory in the west, the south, the east, and that's going to be a very interesting, frustrating point in leading up to World War II. War guilt clause, reparation payments, reduction of military, and loss of territory. And that is World War I.